later in the show. But first, why framing the contraception debate is so important. Jerry Seib is going to explain to us why that is, and he comes to us now from Washington, D.C. Jerry, tell us. Sorry, we don't hear Jerry.
The administration and the Catholic Church has opened up over the last few weeks, and the contours of the debate are pretty well known. You know, it's a question of whether the government can compel Catholic institutions, hospitals, and universities in particular to buy contraceptive services for their employees through their insurance programs. You know, but whether this is seen as a debate over birth control or a debate over religious liberty, I think is the key political question now as this rolls on. And, you know, from the administration's point of view, I think if it can be framed as a debate about birth control, that's a political winner for them, or at least potentially so, because in surveys you see that 80 to 90% of Americans think there's nothing wrong with using birth control, including about 80% of Catholics. So if that's the debate, should there be contraceptive services for women, I think Democrats in the White House will consider it a political winner. On the other hand, if this is seen as a debate about whether the government should intrude on decision-making by church institutions, religious liberty debate, in other words, I think that's a much tougher one for the administration, and that's why Republicans, and particularly Republican presidential candidates, are trying to frame it as that. So over the coming months, which of those this turns out to be seen as by most Americans is pretty important, because the political outcome is quite different depending on which of those it is.
Well, and Jerry, is it more divisive an issue for the GOP primaries than it is for the presidential campaign?
Well,
I mean,
it's not divisive in the Republican primaries, in the sense that I think most Republican voters agree that this is a case of government overreach, regardless of what they think of birth control, contraception, or contraceptive services. I think in that sense, when Republicans complain that this is a case of government intrusion on religious freedoms, that's a pretty consensus view in the Republican primary. Whether that's a view in the middle of the electorate is a different issue entirely, and there you have a question of what do swing voters think of this. Do they think of this as a question of women's rights to contraceptive services, or a question of Obamacare overreach, and that's dangerous ground, as I said, for the administration.
So I've asked this before, but I'll ask it again. Is this an incident where maybe the White House, the administration, the Obama administration, has basically caused a problem when there shouldn't have been one? They could have seen this coming, and they could have written the laws in a different way that would have avoided all this kerfuffle.
Well, I think they created a bigger issue than there needed to be. I think there was going to be some dispute with the bishops, no matter how the administration handled this problem. I think they could have made it a much smaller and more contained dispute if they had written the regulations to enforce the health care law differently. You know, the issue here is, what do employers have to provide in the health insurance policies they give their employees, and what do they have to provide for free, and who is exempt from those rules? What happened is that the administration decided that in the standard health care policy, contraception services ought to be provided without fee as part of a standard health insurance package. And it constructed a fairly narrow exemption, essentially for churches themselves, not for church institutions like schools and hospitals. And they could have made that exemption a little bit wider, I think, at the beginning, and then there probably still would have been a debate on the margins with the bishops, but it wouldn't have turned into as big an issue as it has been. You know, some people think that both sides, the White House and the bishops, want to play this debate up for political purposes. I personally don't buy into that. I think the White House would have preferred not to be here, and I think the bishops believe what they're saying. They don't have much in the way of a political agenda to pursue here. So I think what you see is a genuine debate, but one that was probably avoidable.
So will this come up in tomorrow night's debate, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think particularly because Rick Santorum is now the leading, in at least by national polls over the weekend, the leading Republican candidate. It's his first time in a debate in which he's clearly at the top of the list. And he's a social conservative by choice and by acclamation, and proudly so. And so there's going to be a lot of discussion about his social conservative beliefs. And I think this is one where Rick Santorum has been more outspoken than anybody else, and essentially saying this is an assault on religious freedom. He'll look for opportunities to say that. It'll be interesting to see in that debate, Simon, whether Mitt Romney in particular decides to somehow say, well, your conservative social views are actually a problem for the Republican Party in the general election. because Democrats will portray you as out of the American mainstream because of those views, and therefore you're not as electable as you might be. That's tricky ground for Mitt Romney because he needs the support of those social conservatives. He doesn't want to turn them off, but he also wants to portray himself as the most electable of the candidates.
I'm sure he does. I want to get a quick comment on the amount of spending that Mitt Romney's been doing. It's quite phenomenal in January. Spent nearly 3 times as much money as he raised in January. That's a big spender.
It is. It's striking numbers. He raised about $6.5 million, spent almost $19 million in the month of January, leaving him about $7.7 million in the bank. Now, that's still more money in the bank than any of his Republican opponents have, but it's a pretty striking ratio of spending to contributions, and it's obviously one that can't continue for very long. I think from the Romney campaign's point of view, they had hoped that maybe that big push in January might have sealed the deal, might have closed the race, made him the winner, it wouldn't matter. Well, clearly we're in for a long haul now, so it does matter. And I think what it mostly means is that Mitt Romney needs to raise more money in February, March, and April than he would have thought he would have to. It means he's going to have to spend time doing that. Also means he's going to have to find some new donors, because a lot of those Romney donors are now tapped out. They've hit the $2,500 legal maximum that you can contribute to a primary campaign. So that means that the Romney campaign not only has to raise more money, they have to do the toughest thing, which is to find new donors entirely.